Hello everybody, welcome to my PC guide for 2024. I've been helping some people with some builds lately, and I figured I would do a video talking about getting your first PC, or if you want to get a new one, or maybe you want to modify the current one you have. There's a ton of guides out there. Why would I make my own? I want to give a different perspective. I'm not saying you should only follow my guide. You should definitely check out other people's stuff. The timeline will have sections if you want to skip ahead to a specific section. I'm going to have a section for gaming as well as a section for work/production. Obviously you can do both on the same computer, but you'll have to make considerations for each one. A couple things I should get out of the way first. How this video is going to work is I'm going to go over how a component works. I'm going to explain the specs of the component so you'll know what things are important when you're looking at something, especially in the future, if something I recommend may not be available. Also, I currently use AMD both for my CPU and graphics card. So if you feel like I'm biased towards AMD, that's just what I'm most comfortable with. I will still recommend Intel and NVIDIA stuff, but if you think I'm giving AMD, a more favorable position than they actually have, then you can post a comment, of course, and let me know. Now, before you skip ahead, I would like to talk about the numbering scheme, which is very important because it affects lots of components, but mostly the CPU, graphics card, and here are some example parts up on the screen. So the first digit, or sometimes first two digits, is going to indicate the generation, the series, or basically when it came out. Usually a higher number will indicate a new generation or a new fabrication process, but not always. Sometimes I'll just slap a new number on there and say it's better. I'm looking at you, Intel. Honestly, all three of them do it. The next digit will be the performance tier or performance level from the product. This will change pretty drastically depending on what sort of product you're looking at. So for CPUs, it'll mean something different than it'll be for graphics cards and of course for motherboards. Now, something important to note here about the performance levels, they don't necessarily use all digits. So for example, Intel usually only uses 1, 4, 6, 7, and 9, and NVIDIA and AMD usually only use like 5 through 9. We have the charts of last generation at the time of this video for AMD and NVIDIA's graphics cards, and as you'll see, they don't go all the way down to 1. So a lot of times a 5 or a 6 will actually be the bottom of the product stack, not the middle. So make sure you know what you're getting. And for some reason they like to have 1 or 2 trailing zeros, though sometimes they will actually fill up all the slots. And then of course we have suffixes. These will obviously vary depending on the manufacturer, but the main ones you're going to look out for are X from AMD, means that it's overclocked. K is a pretty similar thing from Intel, but you will need to have a special motherboard for those. F from Intel means that it does not have integrated graphics. From AMD, whether or not it has integrated graphics will depend on the generation. And then from NVIDIA, TI indicates a kind of like an in-between tier. So if you have, for example, like a 3080 and the 3080 Ti and the 3090, the 3080 Ti would be between the 3080 and the 3090. And then for AMD, the XT kind of means the same thing, but they don't always have like in-between models. So sometimes they'll just have an XT and not have a non-XT version. And then Super from NVIDIA usually means it's a refresh where they've kind of updated or redone a specific product. So if the 4080 Super is like an updated version of 4080. And then for AMD up there, X3D or just 3D indicates that it has additional cache. We'll talk about that in the CPU section. Another question you might have is, where should I shop for parts? What do you recommend? So I usually browse on Newegg. I might also buy from Newegg, it just depends, but you can also buy from any of these other places I have listed like Amazon and eBay. I will note that if you're going to shop on eBay for used, that you make sure you check the option for only show sellers that accept returns, because you don't know what you're going to get and you might not like it for some reason, and it'd be nice if you could send it back. It will cost you money unless they take free returns, so watch out for that. The reason I recommend you browse on Newegg is it usually has the best filters, whereas Amazon's kind of generic. Newegg will usually let you get a lot more fine grain on your search. eBay has that a little bit as well. One question you might have is, what about laptops? Can I get a gaming laptop or a work laptop? The problem with laptops is, especially for gaming, it is a high performance task and it needs a lot of power for that. Laptop parts have to be power limited, otherwise they will get too hot because there's not enough surface area or fans to cool the parts properly. I would absolutely not recommend a laptop for gaming. The idea that a gaming laptop exists is an oxymoron to me. There's no such thing as a gaming laptop. You can force your laptop to play a game, but it's not going to have a good time. And same thing for any strenuous activity on the CPU. Also, laptops are, at least from my experience, very unergonomic, and I'll kind of go into that later. Put the laptop kind of awkwardly up on the desk, They don't come with a mouse, so you have to buy an extra mouse, and you also have to like look down at the screen, and you're stuck with whatever display they give you. You can't pick out which monitor you want. And then on top of that, they straight up lie to you about which parts are in the laptop. So if you look at this chart here, you have down here the quote-unquote RTX 4090 laptop, and you'll see that it has 9,728 in the core config column. But if you look up here at the desktop section, that's the RTX 4080, except because it's in a laptop, it'll be power limited. So it'll be even worse than the desktop 4080. So they're literally straight up lying to you right there. And then on the RTX 4080 laptop, you'll see it has 7,424 in the core config, and that is between the RTX 4070 and 4070 Ti. So if you get a laptop, you're gonna pay more to get less and have a less enjoyable experience, at least in my opinion. I would not recommend a laptop. Now, of course, if you have to have one for your work or whatever, obviously that's a different thing. But and then if you need a small, light computer, I'd get a tablet. There are obviously bigger tablets, but there are some small tablets as well you can comfortably hold in one hand. That's what I would get. Okay, another question, of course, is should I build my desktop or should I get a pre-built? Well, I'm going to take a look at a couple of pre-builts I found on Newegg. That's not necessarily indicative of all pre-builts, but hopefully you'll get a good idea. Actually, I was kind of impressed with one of the pre-built. So let's take a look here. We have this Asus ROG Strix model. Comes with a AMD 7600X processor and an RTX 4060 Ti. Now the thing about these is they don't tell you what memory and storage device is in there. They just tell you the capacity, which is a little bit misleading. So I don't know exactly which parts are in this build, and I don't know if I can get that case that they have, but here's a list. This is PC Part Picker, which I'm going to recommend you use to kind of sort out and decide what you're going to build. You can also use it to share a build if you want to see what somebody else is using. So I assembled something close to this build for $1,200. So I saved you over $250. Now, of course, you don't have to assemble it yourself, but I don't think assembling a PC is really that hard. The only thing you can really mess up is the CPU or the motherboard, depending on where the pins are. But otherwise, everything else is pretty much indestructible. Well, okay, if you take a hammer to it, yeah, you can break it, but... Okay, so here is a build with a bigger storage drive. It has twice as much storage, and it has a better graphics card, and still $200 cheaper. Here's a screenshot from Hardware Unboxed, which is a channel I highly recommend, comparing the 4060 Ti, which is what they had in the pre-built, to the 6800, which I put in there. And as you can see, it has a pretty significant FPS increase. If you don't know what that means, I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the gaming section. In this case, no, the pre-built was definitely not a good idea. Now, there's another one by MSI. This one comes with a 13400F CPU, and again, the RTX 4060. Now, you'll note that this one is on a 9% discount. So here's, again, I don't know exactly what they put in there, so here's my guess for about the components, or the components I would pick. And they actually beat me even without the discount. So I was not able to assemble this one for their price, so they do have me beat here. Now again, I don't know about their case, and also I'm not necessarily recommending this case that I have picked out here. That's just one I felt like was a reasonable price indicative of what you might spend on a case. So here's another build. I swapped out a few components, and I did get in for cheaper, though I had to pick out a slightly worse graphics card. So as you can see here, they have highlighted the 4060, and I have put in the 7600 from AMD, so it's a little bit worse. But I did save you a little bit of money. Now I will go back here because I did get a motherboard that takes slower memory compared to the one they have, so that might cost you a little bit of performance in some instances. I don't know if I absolutely need to do this slide, but you may see a company's name on a lot of different components and think, wow, do they really make all that stuff? I don't think they do. So here's some names that you might see. Now, I know that Samsung does actually make quite a lot of their own stuff. Intel does, of course, as well. But for like MSI, Asus, Gigabyte, ASRock, I'm not exactly sure what they do. I think they might just order components from other people and then assemble them and then put their name on it. At least that's my guess. I'm not sure exactly what all they do. I'm not trying to say there's something wrong with assembling components other people have made. A lot of companies do that, but just so that you know, when you see, like, if you see Gigabyte on a monitor and on like a computer or on a graphics card, they didn't make all that stuff. They're just a partner with the company that actually made it. Okay, let's start for gaming. A couple things you'll need to have in mind when we start here is if you have an idea of what kind of games or if a specific game you might like to play, Steam has recommended hardware for everything, so you can consult that if you're not sure, especially if you're building a computer for the first time. You obviously have certain performance expectations for how you'll want your games to run, how you'll want them to look, things like that. If you're not sure about the performance expectations, we'll immediately start talking about those in the next section. Of course, how much can you comfortably spend? Obviously, you don't want to put yourself into debt or something just to buy a gaming PC, because you're not going to get any money from it, probably. Okay, that said, let's talk about the most important component for a gaming PC, and that is the monitor. It's probably not what you were thinking, possibly. But yeah, the monitor is critically important. Going to go over why the monitor is important, and then we'll talk about graphics cards, and then I'll recommend a monitor and graphics cards at the same time, because if you spend way too much on your graphics card and not enough on your monitor won't be able to keep up with your graphics card. And of course, if you go the other way, same thing can happen. Let's talk about how monitors work really quickly. So, monitor is comprised of small lights, which are called pixels. This is, of course, a very simplified version of how it would actually look. You wouldn't really be able to see each individual pixel like this without a microscope. So, to display an image on the screen, it simply adjusts the color of the pixels to match. Now, obviously, this is just a rainbow. And then, of course, if something changes on the screen, then we can update the color of the pixels. Now, to display video or motion, the monitor will rapidly update the color of the pixels to kind of give you the illusion that there's motion. You can see this sort of effect if you have one of those flip books. If you flip it really quickly, it looks like it's actually moving. That's basically how a monitor works. It's just a very quick slideshow. Of course, how quickly will depend on the exact monitor specs, but when you're playing a game or watching a video, how quickly video or video game updates is called what we call the frames per second, because at each frame that the monitor can show over the time, which should be a second. So for monitor specs, these are probably the most important things you'll want to know about. The size of the monitor is important because you'll need to know if you can integrate it into your setup, especially if you're getting multiple monitors. So you'll need to know if there's room on your desk, table, stack of boxes, concrete blocks, whatever you got going on. You need to make sure your monitors can fit there. If not, then you'll have to possibly consider something else. Another really important thing about the monitor is the resolution. So how many pixels are there on the screen? That's what we're going to answer with the resolution. The more pixels there are on the monitor, the more definition or the more detail that it can show. However, the downside, of course, is the monitor will be harder to run for your graphics card or your integrated graphics on your CPU. A subset of the resolution is the aspect ratio, which determines the layout of the pixels. So the standard aspect ratio is 16:9 or 1.77777:1. So for each one vertical pixel, there's 1.7777 horizontal pixels. And as for standard resolutions go, these will be probably the most common ones. So it'll be 1920 by 1080, or just called 1080p, 2560 by 1440, and 3840 by 2160. Now, someone had the bright idea that we need to throw out the naming convention and call 2160p 4K. I'm not going to do that, but if you do see it in other people's videos, they may call this 4K. I'm not going to do that. If you want to know the number of pixels on the screen, simply multiply those two together. Now, there's another aspect ratio that's not quite as popular, but there's ultra wide, which is, it's not quite 21 by 9. It's 2.37 per one vertical pixel. And then here would be some examples of ultra wide resolutions. Now, why would you want an ultra wide monitor? In first-person games, a wider monitor will fill your peripheral vision more, and it can make the game more immersive. Or if you don't quite have enough room on your desk for, say, 2 monitors, you might just have one ultra-wide monitor. Though they can be more expensive and you'll have fewer options, so you probably want to get a standard resolution monitor, unless you, again, have a specific ultra-wide monitor you want to get. So the refresh rate is how many frames per second the monitor can display. So for example, if you have a 60 hertz monitor, that means it can update 60 times per second. So if you're watching a 60 FPS video, you'll be just fine. But if you had, say, a 30 hertz monitor and you're watching a 60 hertz video, you'd only be able to see half the frames. And conversely, if your graphics card can run the game at, say, like 200 frames per second, but your monitor is only 60 hertz, you're only going to see 60 of those frames. So you might have spent too much on your graphics card, or this game just might be really easy to run compared to what you're normally playing, which is totally fine. So there'll be some common refresh rates. 60 is usually considered like the minimum these days, and then of course you can go up from there to 100, 120, 200, so on. There's even 500 hertz monitors, and if you're watching this in the future, they'll probably be even higher. The main thing that you'll need to know about having a high refresh rate monitor is, of course, you'll need to have a powerful graphics card for the resolution that it is, and you'll also probably need to have a powerful CPU. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the CPU section, but it can be hard to run a high refresh rate monitor, so just keep that in mind when you're looking at it. You want to pick a refresh rate you're likely to hit most of the time with your graphics card, and you could potentially go higher, but you'd only hit that in some games unless you turn down the settings. One of the most important parts of the monitor is the color gamut. Hopefully I'll put the gamut definition up on the screen right now. The colors of the monitor are always going to be on display, so even if you're not gaming, this is the sRGB scale here displayed, and when you're looking at monitors, they'll usually show a percentage of a specific color spectrum. So for example, you might see this listed on the monitor specs, and of course you can go above 100% here, as you can see on our chart. However, there's another standard called DICP3, and you may see percentages like these. I would be very skeptical if a monitor says it has 100% DCI-P3, but it might actually, and of course in the future it might be above 100%, and there might be other standards as well, but these are two that are commonly used right now. Another important aspect is the response time. This is how long it takes the pixels to start updating when they receive a request to update from the monitor. This might sound like the refresh rate, but it's not quite the same. A monitor with a slow response time will leave trails or ghosting of things, especially if they're moving across the screen rapidly. Those are some common response times. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, most of the time they're lying to you about the response time on monitors. Like, oh, they'll say 1 millisecond, and then that can be anywhere from like actually 18 milliseconds to like actually 1 millisecond. So if this is a really big deal to you, you probably want to watch a review of the monitor and have someone record the screen with a camera, which is what you're going to see in the next slide. Screenshot for monitors unboxed. I didn't ask it for permission. This is the test UFO, and it will move this alien across the screen, and then you record the screen, not with capture software, but with the camera, and you can see how much blur or distortion there is on the UFO. Monitor with a bad response time is going to have a blurrier image here when we look at it with the camera. Now, these two columns here are different settings that they have for the specific monitor. And here will be from another video, this monitor has a much better response time, so the alien is less blurry. And lastly, there are some other specs, but we'll kind of talk about those as we go through this, is the monitor panel type. So that's how the monitor works, which technology is employed. The main two types currently competing right now are LCD and OLED. So LCD has been around longer, it's a lot cheaper than OLED, it can get brighter. OLED monitors have trouble getting as bright as LCD monitors because there's a risk of burn-in with a long exposure to high brightness. So your OLED monitor may not last forever. Now, on the flip side, OLED has a very good contrast because of the way LCD works. It has a hard time displaying dark colors, especially black. OLED was much better in that. OLED also has a much faster response time than LCD, and usually has a higher refresh rate, though that can depend. There are LCD monitors that can have higher refresh rates. So a common response time for like an LCD screen might be like 1 millisecond or like half a millisecond, but for OLED that would be very slow. There are OLED monitors that have like 0.03 milliseconds response times or even faster. Now, since LCD has been around for a while, there is more than one type of LCD. So let's take a look at those. There's IPS, TN, and VA. To talk about some of the differences between these, we'll need to talk about another spec, and that's going to be the viewing angle. So that is, from what angles can you view the monitor before the image gets distorted? So by default, this would be you and the monitor looking directly at the screen without any angle, so the image should not be distorted. However, if you're looking at the monitor from a different angle, the image might be distorted. You might say, well, why would I be off center like this? Well, you could have like multiple monitors, and you might not be perfectly on center for either one of them. So, if we come back, IPS has the best viewing angle compared to the other two types. So, if you're going to have multiple monitors, it's generally best to have IPS because it'll give you the best viewing angle. IPS also has the widest color gamut, which means it has the best colors usually. TN has the fastest response time and highest refresh rate. So these will be good if you like to play competitive multiplayer games. You might want to get a TN monitor over an IPS. And there is vertical alignment, which is between IPS and TN as far as refresh rate and color gamut and viewing angles go. And for some reason, VA is often curved. You might ask why I want a curved monitor. Let's go back to our viewing angle example. Of course, if you're head on here, but let's make the monitor a little bit wider. Okay, especially if you have like an ultra wide monitor. Now, if you look toward, say, the edge of the screen, the image might be distorted a little bit. So to fix this, you can have a curved monitor. There won't be any distortion at any point, as long as you're, of course, lined up right. If you're sitting off to the side of a curved monitor, it might start to look a little bit weird. So who should buy each type of monitor? Well, if you're going to get a curved monitor, you might have to get a VA, so that may not be an option for you, but there are curved IPS panels as well. For most people, I'm going to recommend you get an IPS panel because the colors are always going to show whether you're playing a game on Discord, watching a video. If you like to play competitive multiplayer games very seriously, you may not be able to get the refresh rate or response time you want in an IPS panel, so you may have to get a TN panel. Okay, let's talk about the thing that will be running your monitor, which is the graphics card or video card, or some people might call it a GPU. Now, technically the GPU is only part of the graphics card, but it's easier to type GPU than graphics or video cards, so you may see some people abbreviate it like that. How does a graphics card work? They will receive a message from the CPU that something has changed on the screen. They'll tell the graphics card what's on the screen. Then the graphics card will do a calculation and figure out what color each of the pixels on the screen need to be, and then we'll send it over to the monitor. We'll take a look at this a little bit more when we look at CPUs, but that's the basics for how graphics cards work, at least in games. So graphics cards have specs pretty similar to CPUs, but they do have a couple of other things that we'll need to look at. The most important part of the graphics card is actually not the spec sheet. It's the software that runs the graphics card. So when you're comparing graphics cards, really the best thing to do is watch a review. So I would recommend Gamers Nexus and Hardware Unboxed. We can look at the spec sheet, but honestly, a lot of it doesn't really mean a whole lot because the software is so much more important. But we will look at the specs so that you'll have an idea of what they all mean, but honestly you should probably watch a review and only look at the spec sheet if there's something new that's getting teased or something you're not sure if you should buy something. You can usually look at something if it's from the same generation and look at the specs and get a good idea of the performance level. So here is the chart of the RTX 40 series, which is the current NVIDIA generation. There's quite a lot of stuff here, and honestly some of this stuff does not really mean anything at all, so we're going to cut through that and we're going to look at the core config. This is going to be how many processors or cores the graphics card has. The more cores that it has, the easier it is to process a large resolution, and it can usually also handle a higher refresh rate. So generally the more cores or the higher processor count, the better. There's also how quickly the processors run. This is measured in megahertz, which is millions of cycles per second. The parentheses there is how high they can boost under certain loads. So by taking a look at the core config and how fast they run, you can usually get a pretty good idea of the graphics card's performance. But again, the software is much more important. Now, another thing that's much more important and easy to understand is the memory. So this is how much stuff the graphics card can have loaded in at a time. If the graphics card does not have enough memory to store everything, it'll have to put some of the things onto the system memory, and then if it wants to go access that memory, it'll be much slower because graphics cards usually have much faster memory than your standard system memory. So it's important to have enough memory to handle whatever game you're playing. And then of course there's also the memory speed, and then there's also the interface between the GPU and the memory. This will be called the bus or the bandwidth. The higher the bandwidth, the more memory that can be accessed at a time, or at least that'll be the rate the memory that gets accessed. Since graphics cards access their memory quite often, the bandwidth and bus width can be a pretty big deal. So if you're getting you might be getting a model that has a high amount of processors and high frequency, but if the bandwidth is very limited, then that can hugely impact the performance as well. So the memory configuration can be just as important as the core configuration as well. And then another thing we can see here is we can see the power. Now they won't always draw this much power, but when you're looking at getting a power supply, you'll usually have to consult your graphics card, as usually your CPU doesn't use anywhere near as much power. So you need to make sure your power supply can easily handle the amount of power your graphics card can use. Now if you're having trouble with that, you can turn the power on the graphics card down, but it's still better to have a much stronger power supply than you need. Now, unfortunately, they don't tell you the interface graphics card connection to the motherboard on this chart for some reason. So we're gonna have to go to the AMD chart, and they tell you over here the how many PCIe lanes the graphics card uses. Now, by itself, this is usually not a big deal, but if you start hooking up PCIe storage devices, which we'll talk about later, then this will be very important to you. But most graphics cards will usually take 16 lanes of PCI 3.0 or 4.0. Alright, so now that we've talked about monitors and graphics cards, I'm going to recommend some specific monitors and graphics cards. Now, of course, if you're watching this in the future, these monitors may not be available, as monitors come and go pretty regularly, so you'll have to look at the specs and hopefully figure something out. So when I was looking at 1080p monitors, this one popped out to me as pretty obviously the best one, at least on Newegg. Now, earlier on I mentioned resolutions, I just called them by a number, but technically they have a name as well, and this is usually the only time you're going to see the name. So here FHD is, as it says, 1080p. So like it doesn't say, some monitors won't even tell you the resolution like that in the name, they'll just use the name. So FHD is 1080p, QHD is 1440p, and UHD is 2160p. So this is a pretty solid monitor. The response time there could maybe be a little bit better, but for the price, it's really solid. As far as graphics cards that could run this monitor, you could go back as far as using an RX 580. Now these are on eBay because they're used. These haven't been new for a while, so you could totally go with one of these, and this would probably be fine for a lot of games. Now if the game's really demanding, the RX 580 will not be able to handle it, but for a lot of games you could get in one of these used for really cheap, and that's probably what I'd recommend if you're really constrained on your budget. Now if you can spend a bit more, you can get the RX 6600 here. I have a couple examples for about $200. This is quite a lot better than the RX 580, but of course it is 3 to 4 times the price of buying a used RX 580. You could buy a used RX 6600 as well. It's totally an option. You can pretty much always buy anything used, unless it's like brand new, then it may not be available. You could also spend a bit more and get the RTX 3060 12GB version, which is the best seller on Newegg and definitely a very good pick. It is a little bit expensive for 1080p, but it would totally work. You could also go with the 6650 XT, which is a bit of a step up from the RX 6600, or you could get a used set 6700 XT from eBay as well. And again, these prices will probably not be the same when you're watching this in the future, and these are just listings I found when I made the video. So here is a chart from Hardware Unboxed going over some graphics cards at 1080p. Now this is in the 12 games that they specifically tested in this video, so you have to go watch that video. This, based on the highlights here, this is, I believe, this 7600 XT video. So you can get an idea here of the rough performance at 1080p across usually AAA games they usually show. So if you don't play AAA games, then you'll probably get a much better performance than this. Now you might say, oh, well, I want to play 1080p, but I like to play multiplayer games, so I want a high refresh rate. Okay, so here are some options. This first monitor is actually an IPS monitor, which kind of confused me because I thought it would probably be a TN, but a pretty reasonable price. And then down here we have a much more expensive BenQ, which is also 240 hertz. You might be asking, why hell would I get that? Well, it has a faster response time, and that might be a big deal to you. And then of course, if you have lots of money or you're a very serious multiplayer gamer, there's a 540 hertz TN panel down here with a very fast response time of 1/5 of a millisecond. So now obviously if you're going to get that one, you're going to need a much more powerful graphics card than the ASRock monitor from earlier. So here are some potential graphics cards. Again, you could use the 6700 XT, you could get a 6800 non-XT, which is what I have. I don't have that specific one, but that's what I have right now. You get a 6800 XT used, and you can always go above this. You could get a 1600 XT, you might be able to use the 3060 from earlier, and of course you could probably use something from the 40 series as well, but these will probably be the best value. The 6800 XT and 7800 XT are basically the same in performance, but they'll vary depending on the game, so I would probably just save money and go with the used 6800 XT unless you really like some features on the 7800 XT, such as better ray tracing. But so now if you want to go with high resolution, go with 1440p. This Gigabyte G27Q is a really good deal. This is actually one of the monitors that I have right now. I got them as $250, and it's come down even more. Compared to my previous monitor, it really blew me away, especially with the colors. I've been really impressed with it. And it has a high refresh rate compared to what I had before. The only complaint I'll make about it is, well, the power button's kind of awkward, and also it is, mine specifically is a very red. I have the red turned down 20%. And I think that might be okay. M27Q below it here is basically the same thing, except it's better in pretty much every category. Faster response time, higher refresh rate, and it has a wider color gamut. But of course, you have to pay more for it as well. So, and here are a couple of ASRock options. Now, the ones I just showed you, those are both IPS. These are both VA, but they are quite a bit cheaper, especially the top one here. Now, this one's a 27-inch, that one's a 32-inch. I'm not really sure how I feel about a bigger monitor. I guess it just depends on how much room you have. Personally, I'd go for the 27, but that's because I'm somewhat limited on space. If you're not limited on space, you might like the 32-inch better. Okay, let's talk about graphics cards. So of course you can use the 3060 from earlier, and you've seen most of these already. They did the 6900 XT in there, which does use quite a lot of power, but it would be a solid option for this resolution. Of course, you could get a 7800 XT or the 4070 Super. So again, let's check out the chart from Hardware Unboxed. And this one is comparing the 7800 XT and the 4070. That's why those are highlighted. But you can get an idea of what the graphics cards I recommended earlier might get. Now, the 6900 XT is not on here, and they have the 6950 XT on here. It's a bit faster. I'm not exactly sure how much, but probably no more than 10%. It's probably like 5%. So take 5% off that, and you get what the 6900 XT would give you. All right, let's talk about resolutions above 1440p. We have two monitors here that are 2160p, and the first one is actually really quite affordable, but both of these are 60 hertz. So it can be kind of hard to run 2160p. So 60 hertz is kind of where you jump in. The only problem I have with both these is their response time's kind of bad compared to some other monitors, but they are reasonably affordable, especially that Acer. Now, if you want to spend some more money, you could get some pretty serious monitors here. These are both 28-inch IPS. Okay, wow, the MSI is actually only 60 hertz. Now that I look at it, I don't know why that's in the video. I guess I missed that somehow. Do not buy that MSI. That's way too fucking expensive. Just buy one of these instead, because you save like $100 plus. Okay, yeah, don't buy that. That's trash. The Gigabyte is quite a bit more expensive than the other ones, but it's 144 hertz and has a much faster response time, so that might be worth it. Now, earlier I mentioned that LCD monitors are much cheaper than OLED monitors. So if you are if you have very low income, just pretend the next slide doesn't exist. Okay, so here are some OLED monitors, and as you can see, they're all very expensive. The Alienware one is from Best Buy. That's why it looks different from the ones that are on Newegg. But yeah, the second Asus one there is a 3440 by 1440, so it is an ultra wide instead of being 2160p. And of course, the one from Best Buy is also 3440 by 1440. Now, graphics cards for 2160p or ultra wide 1440p, of course, you could use the 6800, and you can go up from there. We've pretty much gone over all these. However, we'll be introducing some new players. You could get the 7900 XT, which is right now about $700. In the future, you might be able to get it for used or for less. There's also the 7900 XTX. I don't know why it's called the XTX. I don't know why the other one's not called the 7900 and this one's not called the 7900 XT. I guess more X's make it cooler. These would be the maximum I would spend on a graphics card right now, because to buy a better NVIDIA card, you have to spend significantly more, because NVIDIA cards cost more because they control the supply and they have a huge fanatic fan base. Or, well, they did. I don't know if it might be shrinking, but yeah, I would stop here personally, but we'll go ahead and look at the next slide just for morbid curiosity. So here's the MSRP of the RTX 4090 and 4080 Super. And the 4080 Super, at the time of this video, just came out like a month ago, and you can see it's already 10% above MSRP. And that was the cheapest 4090, by the way. A lot of them are like $2,200 or something. That's because there's some export restrictions on them, and that's made their price go up quite a lot. So I would absolutely not buy the 4090. It's like maximum, I think, like 33% better than the 7900 XTX in most games. Now, in some specific situations, I think it's quite a bit more than that, but on average, I think it's like 20 to 25% faster, and it's over double the money. So I would never buy the 4090. Good. So here's a look at some of the graphics cards at 2160p. Now, of course, as you can see here, the 4090 is pretty significantly better than the 7900 XTX on average, but it's twice as much money and it's not twice as fast. So I would not even think about it. Okay, let's talk about CPUs. So first up, CPU stands for Central Processing Unit. It handles pretty much everything that happens on the computer that's not graphics, and some CPUs can even handle graphics a little bit as well, though not as well as a video card, of course. So when you're playing games, the main thing CPUs do is they handle draw calls. So what's a draw call? Here's a rough estimation about how a draw call works. So something changes, maybe you turn the camera, or an NPC walks around, or the wind blows and the grass moves or the branches rustle. CPU says, hey, something happened. Here's what's in the scene. So like what should be on the screen. Sends that over to the video card. Based on what the CPU sends over the video card, calculates the color all the pixels should be. Then it sends it over to the monitor, and then the monitor adjusts the pixel colors. Now, of course, this happens really quickly. The way that this graph flows is going to depend on speed of each of these things. So, for example, if your monitor cannot update as quickly as the graphics card, then the graphics card is going to be sending it more update requests than it can handle. So the monitor is going to be limiting what actually happens. Now, if you have like a FPS tracker, it'll show, whatever the video card is sending the monitor, but the monitor won't necessarily be updating that quickly. Now, if the CPU can handle draw calls quicker than the graphics card, there'll be a pile up at the graphics card. So then there'll be what would be called graphics limited, or video card limited, or GPU limited. So then either like lowering the game settings, or lowering the resolution, or getting a more powerful graphics card would alleviate the burden there. However, there's also this situation where the CPU is sending requests to the graphics card and they're getting processed immediately, so the graphics card's waiting on the CPU. This can happen especially if the game is CPU demanding, such as Baldur's Gate 3, especially in the city. The graphics card will be waiting on the CPU to send it draw requests. So in that case, getting a faster video card or lowering the resolution, stuff like that, probably won't do anything. CPUs have a few different attributes, and one of the most important ones is the socket. So there are two types of sockets. There are LGA sockets and PGA sockets, and I've got to say the one on the right is making me cringe because they bent the pins, which means it is inoperable, but this is just a picture, so don't worry about that. In a PGA socket, the pins are on the CPU. On an LGA socket, the pins are on the motherboard. This is pretty much the only part you can actually break if you're assembling the computer yourself, so be careful if you're handling a PGA socket CPU. And there's always a cover for the pins on an LGA socket. That picture is worrying me. It should not look like that. There should be a plastic cover that protects the pins in case you drop something on it. So my advice is leave the cover on. When you install the CPU, obviously move the cover, install the CPU, and tighten down the mechanism that holds it in place, and leave it like that. Do not take the CPU out, because if you're working with some screws or something, you can drop those into the socket and that can bend or break some pins, and now your motherboard doesn't work. Let's talk about CPU cores. So we'll pretend our CPU has 4 cores. Now you might think they should be numbered 1 through 4, but computers start counting as 0, so it'll be core 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now we'll look at how the CPU might work during a game. So it might have something like this. Each core can handle different things. They can communicate with each other, but usually each one will have its own separate thing that it's doing. And these will of course all come together, but each one can track something different. So let's say core 1 is handling draw calls for the game, and then maybe core 1 is doing physics calculations, like how your character is colliding with the terrain, or maybe how the wind is affecting something, or if there's something like rolling down a hill. And then core 2 might be handling the enemy. I'm putting AI in quotes here because they're probably not actually AI, it's just a decision-making tree, but there's, it might be using some random numbers in there, it might calculate those, or it might be, weighing certain decisions against each other. So, and then in this case, core 3 might not be doing anything. So adding extra cores for a lot of games won't really do anything because there's not other things to be processed. If you want a more in-depth look at how the CPU works, I will cover that in the production section. An important aspect of the CPU is the frequency. That is how quickly it will operate. So let's look at a couple examples here. We have 4 gigahertz and 2.5 gigahertz. That's how many instructions that the CPU can do in 1 second. Instruction is how the CPU communicates, basically. So 4 gigahertz means it can handle 4 billion instructions per second, and then on the right it'd be 2.5 billion instructions per second. That's a lot of instructions, but you'd be surprised what can happen. Another aspect is the IPC, which is the instructions per clock, or how many instructions it can do in a clock cycle, which in this case is a hertz. So if the IPC is 1, then processor on the left can do 4 billion instructions per second, same as before. But if the CPU on the right can handle 2 instructions at a time, then it would now have 5 billion instructions per second. Now, unfortunately, the CPU manufacturers don't actually publish the IPC, so you can't really do this calculation, but you can kind of get an idea. If you have CPUs and you lock them at the same speed, you can get an idea of which one finishes work faster or just runs faster, because it'll have higher instructions per clock. Generally, newer CPUs will have higher instructions per clock. That's pretty much always true across the board. So if you're not sure, usually a newer CPU will be faster just purely on the IPC increase. All right, now let's talk about the cache. So when the CPU is working with data, it will need to store some of that directly on it in the cache. So here's how the cache might be laid out for a CPU. So the L1 cache, each core has its own cache of data that it is directly responsible for, and then there might be clusters of cores that have cache. That would be L2 cache, and then there's L3 cache, which would be for all the cores. Now, previously you really couldn't pick or decide how much cache CPUs have, but AMD's come out with some CPUs that have extra cache, and a lot of games really appreciate that extra cache. My general advice for buying a CPU for a game is to buy low-tier models, because Higher tier models usually only get you extra cores, and they might get you higher frequency, but usually you're going to spend a whole lot more and the difference won't be that great. You should probably buy AMD 3D models if you can afford them, as the extra cache is great in a lot of games. Do not buy AMD G models. These have more integrated graphics on the CPU, but it's worse than having a dedicated graphics card, and it will make the CPU slower compared to another, like a non-G CPU, so just don't get those. And do not buy the 900 or 950 3D chips. You should just buy whatever the lowest tier model is, because those have extra cores that you don't need, and currently they are putting the extra cache on only half of the cores. So the other cores are basically useless when you're playing a game, and a lot of times, and at least currently how it works, is they'll disable the other one. So you might as well just get the lowest tier one, because you're basically getting the same thing anyway. Now you might think this is the part where I'd recommend CPUs, but I actually need to talk about memory and motherboards first, and then I'll recommend all three of them together. So the next thing, of course, is memory, or random access memory. The basic way the memory works is it stores applications that are currently running, and you can read and write from it while you are doing things. Now I'll talk about the relationship between memory and storage later when we get to storage, but for now just know that memory is where applications live that are currently being used. So the main specs for RAM are going to be the generation/socket, the capacity, so that's how much it can store. The higher the capacity, the more applications you can have loaded at one time. How fast the memory is, and how quickly you can access the memory. So generally, at least currently right now, the main types of memory you're going to use are DDR4 and DDR5. Now I've tried to lay these out here so you can see that these pins do not line up. You cannot stick a DDR5 into a DDR4 slot or the other way around. Now the nice thing about memory is that memory doesn't usually have a name. They just literally list out the specs for you. So here's a set of DDR4 G-Skill. This is one of the best values and what I'd recommend you for buying DDR4. So let's break it down real quick. So right here they say DDR4, so that tells you the generation. And right here they tell you how much memory there is. So there's 2 sticks of 8 gigabytes. Usually most motherboards will have room for 2 or 4 sticks of memory, so you'll need to keep that in mind when you are purchasing memory. Over here we'll tell you how fast it is. Now they may mistakenly list this as the megahertz. The speed will usually be twice the megahertz because DDR stands for double data rate, so they'll usually just put that in as, oh, it's actually twice that fast. So this will actually run at 1600 megahertz. And then down here we can see the timings. The timings dictate how quickly the memory can be accessed. This is the number of cycles that it takes to access the memory. So the speed of the memory, so like up here at 3200, that dictates how quickly 16 cycles takes. Okay, so 16 cycles on something that's, say, 3200 speed would be half as fast as a 6400 kit that had 16 latency. Now, there's not a kit that's going to be that fast, by the way. I'm just going to tell you right now, at least not anytime soon, maybe in the future. So let's take a look at some DDR5 memory real quick. This is some G-Skill for DDR5, and as you'll see here, the latency has gone up quite a bit because it is much faster, so that latency is actually about the same amount of time. Right now these are about the cheapest, I believe, for DDR5 6000. The difference between these two is just in the timings. And then here's another set if you want some color on your memory. These are a bit more expensive, of course, and that one model up there at the top is a bit faster. You don't have to buy from G-Skill, by the way. They're just usually the most affordable. Okay, let's talk about motherboards, and oh my goodness, the cover in the middle one is good. Those other two having the covers not on worries me. That's how you get damaged motherboard pins. So motherboards connect all of this stuff in the computer together. And the main things you're going to see are going to be the CPU socket, the RAM, the connectivity, so that's going to be PCIe slots, and then the input and output. So when you're looking at motherboards, you'll need to look through all the connectivity and make sure that it has enough connectivity for you. Now you might be asking, what the heck's a PCIe lane? Okay, this is going to be a simplified version, of course. Let's pretend we have 8 lanes from lane 0 over there to lane 7, and kind of think of this as like a highway. So when you hook up things, they're going to use lanes. So for example, plug up our video card, that's probably going to use at least half of our lanes. A lot of times they'll use like 2/3 or 3/4 of your lanes. So, but for right now, let's just say it uses half your lanes. Okay, so then let's say when plugging your storage drive. Okay, we'll say that uses 2 more lanes. Like, you know what, that storage drive not big enough, or maybe I bought a new one that's even bigger. So let's boom. Okay, now we're using all of our lanes. And you say, and I want to plug in another storage drive. Now, I'm not exactly sure how it's going to do this, but this is just an example, so don't assume that this is how it's going to break up your lanes. So we're going to split these two lanes here at the end, and then boom, now you got storage drive split up like that. Now in reality, it's probably not going to do it exactly like that, but this is how you can visualize how PCI lanes kind of work. Okay, let's talk about motherboard chipset. The motherboard chipset is kind of like the specification for the motherboard. Manufacturer like Intel or AMD can specify certain things that they want that chipset to provide. So here's the chipset for AM4 motherboards. Now over here you'll notice the models, they'll have an A, a B, and an X. But the problem is that's redundant, because if it's a 20, A and 20 mean the same thing, B and 50 mean the same thing, X and 70 mean the same thing. So like a B450, B550, that's just redundant. You could just say 550 or a B5 or however you want to think about it. The letters are redundant. One of the things that this chipset does is it provides PCIe connections. However, the CPU usually provides more and better connections than the chipset. So usually you don't really have to worry about this column. So like for example, my B450 motherboard says only provides PCI 2.0, but my CPU provides PCI 3.0, and I think it provides 24 lanes, so this doesn't really matter to me. But the chipset can have certain other features, like for example, if you're allowed to overclock it. So for example, if you have like the A520, or like these up here, you're not allowed to overclock it. But if you have any other ones, you can. So that might be something you care about. And there's also which CPU generation they support. So you'll see here it varies. So like for my B450, I had to get a motherboard update for this to work. So, but if you like the X570, boom, you can just drop Zen 3 right in there. So when you're looking to buy a motherboard, you'll need to consider the chipset, what sort of features they have, and what level of connectivity they might have additionally, or what sort of features you're getting. A lot of times you're paying extra for the like X series over the B series, and you're usually not getting a whole lot, if anything. You might be getting something sometimes. So like for example, in the new AMD AM5 socket, they have E models, and E indicates that they have PCIe 5.0 support for sure, but there's not really currently anything that uses PCIe 5.0. Okay, so let's look at some combos. This would probably be the most affordable option. This would be the 12100F from Intel with the appropriate motherboard and DDR4 memory. Now, you can get motherboards for this that use DDR5, but the extra performance you get from that is probably not worth it, especially at this price tier. So this would be the cheapest one you could get. Now, this would definitely not be a good idea if you're going for the high refresh rate option, or you're getting a powerful graphics card with a high refresh rate monitor, because this will probably not be able to keep up. But if you're going for like 2160p, like 60 hertz, or you're just going for 1080p, whatever I can possibly get to work, then this is definitely fine. Now, for some reason, PC Part Picker is mad at me on all of these 5000 processors. I'm not sure why, because I feel like this should be compatible, but I'm just letting you know it's angry at me. Now, if you got one of these and it didn't work, you would have to get someone else with a CPU that is compatible, then update the BIOS, which is the motherboard software, and then you could use their CPU. So for example, I have a 1700X and I have a B450 motherboard, which is from before the 5000 series came out. So I had to update the BIOS on my CPU, then remove the CPU, and then put in my 5700X, and then I could use the motherboard again. Then I sold off my 1700X. So just a heads up, if you see these compatibility warnings, you may need to like take them to the Micro Center, or I don't know if Best Buy has any sort of service like that. So be careful when you're ordering, because otherwise you may have compatibility issues, and if the CPU doesn't work, you can't use the motherboard to update the BIOS. So be careful. So this would be a cheap option for AMD. Now, you can upgrade this CPU in the future potentially from this 5600, but you could also totally do that on the 12100F if you wanted to go up to like a 12400 or 12600. You can totally do that as well. So here would be another option. This is a relatively new CPU at the time of making this video. This is the 5700 3D, and this will get very nice performance in most games, again with the extra cache, but it is pretty significantly more expensive compared to the last one. So if you're looking for really good performance at a fairly affordable cost, this would be probably the way to go. You're going to see the CPU cooler I have run like all of them. This is one of the best air coolers, and just get it. There are other options, but honestly, just get this one. It's really good. If you wanted to go onto the AM5 platform, which will get more CPUs over time, so you could potentially upgrade in the future, like I did with mine, though that was on AM4. So this would be the cheapest AM5 CPU you can currently get, but it does require DDR5, which as you can see is over twice as expensive as the DDR4 that you would get on AM4. Wow, these motherboards are the same price. That's weird. This would give you, as they say, an upgrade path in the future if you wanted to get, say, like a, I don't know, like an 8600X or 9600X or whatever. You could potentially do that. And this would be pretty much the top of the line gaming setup available right now with the 7800 3D. Now the confusing thing about the 7800 3D is it's the same thing as a theoretical 7700 3D. The 8 tier basically doesn't do anything that the 7 tier doesn't do. So get this one, or if in the future they have like a 7700 3D or a 7600 3D, probably get that. Now there are some other components you'll need, like storage and a case and some other things. I will talk about that after I do the production section, because I will talk about all of that stuff together. So you can skip past the production section if you want and go straight to the storage, I believe is the next thing. Okay, so if you want to do production work, have a hobby, whatever you want to call it, you're going to need to know some stuff, and I will not be able to answer these questions for you. So you're going to need to know which applications you're going to use. You'll need to know which components are best utilized by the application. So some applications might run pretty well on a CPU, but they might run better on a graphics card, or they might not run on a graphics card at all. So you may have to have a powerful CPU. You're going to have to do some research, unfortunately, because I can't tell you what you're going to need. Some applications are really like a CPU with a lot of cores. Some applications only use one core, so you're going to have to know. Some things can take a while to process, so you'll need to weigh how important it is for things to finish quickly. If you're especially getting paid and you could make more money or do things quicker and thus get paid for more jobs if things finish quicker, then you may want to put more importance on parts that would allow you to finish your work quicker. However, if it's not a big deal to you, like it's just a hobby, or you're going to get it paid the same no matter what, then you could spend less and not worry about that. And of course, how much you can spend, maybe the company's paying for this, so maybe you can afford to spend more than you might on a personal rig. So let's talk about CPUs. So first up, CPU stands for Central Processing Unit. It handles pretty much everything that happens on the computer that's not graphics. And some CPUs can even handle graphics a little bit as well, though not as well as a video card, of course. How do CPUs work? CPUs, at least currently, are broken up into cores. As you can see here, we have cores 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now you might think they should be numbered 1 through 4, but computers start counting at 0. So this would be an example of this would be a theoretical drawing of a 4-core CPU. The way that CPUs work is they have an instruction set, which is the language that the CPU understands. Different CPUs can have different instruction sets, but really that's not going to matter too much to you. So let's say we have some hypothetical instructions here, A through L. Of course, this is abstract, so each one of these would be like a command that the CPU would run. One way to think about how cores work is we could imagine this is like a bank, for example, and we have 4 tellers and customers come in and they want to do something with their account. Now this example is going to kind of fall apart pretty quickly, but we can go with it for a little bit. So we could have everybody come in and line up on the first counter 0. It doesn't really make any sense though, because the other tellers wouldn't be really doing anything. So we could split up everybody like this evenly. Now this assumes a couple of things. Like at one, it assumes that all of these transactions are going to take the same amount of time, because if some of them are quicker than others, we might want to rearrange these a little differently. So like, for example, if C is going to take a really long time, but A, E, and I can get finished before C is done, then we'd probably want G to go around to C0. But again, this is just a theoretical example. Now the problem with our model here is most of the time when people come into the bank, they're not going to access the same account that's been accessed already today. They're all going to be independent from each other. However, when we're working with instructions in the CPU, that's unlikely. So let's back up a little bit, and let's say that we have 3 accounts that are going to get access. We're going to have the red account, the blue account, and the green account are going to get access, and those instructions are associated with each other. So if we go back and we hand everybody an instruction, the problem here is I don't know what's going to happen, because A and C are going to happen at the same time, maybe? A might complete first, C might complete first. Now, since C is after A, we probably want A to complete first, since we've ordered them like this. But Core 2 might be faster than Core 0, or C might be easier to execute than A, so C might finish first. And then obviously C would have the wrong result. So for example, with our bank analogy, if C came in to withdraw money, but was expecting A to be deposit money before them, they might withdraw more than the account has, and obviously that'd be a problem. So it's important to get the order right here. So this is why we can't just willy-nilly hand out instructions like this. So now you could say, oh wait, well I know which accounts are going to get access, so we can group them up like this. But the problem is when someone's writing a program, they might not know exactly which things can be accessed independently from each other. So the safest option, though would be slower, it would be to just slap them all on core 0. A lot of programs run like this. So the reason I went into all this depth is you need to understand that some programs can absolutely run like this, where they hand out the instructions across the cores and all the cores get loaded up, which is great. But a lot of programs don't do that, either because they can't, or they don't know exactly what's going to happen. So they know that C is going to happen after B, but they might not, B might be tangentially related to C, and it can be a pain to program that like that potentially. So if your program is set up like this, then of course you'll care about speed of each core, not how many cores. But if your program can run like this, then you'll care a lot more about more cores. So it'll depend on the application. And some applications can do a little bit of both. They might only be able to use like 3 or 4 cores instead of like all 16 or 32 or however many cores you have. CPUs have several different specs that we'll cover, and one of the most important ones is the socket. There are 2 types of sockets right now. There are PGA sockets, which have the pins on the CPU, and LGA sockets, which have the pins on the motherboard. Now, all of the Intel sockets, as far as I'm aware, are LGA, and AM5 as well as the Threadripper socket have pins on the motherboard. So when you are picking out a CPU, you'll need to note the socket. So later when we talk about motherboards, you'll make sure you pick the right motherboard. So another aspect is the frequency, which I kind of hinted at right there, is how quickly can the CPU run it. Or this will refer to each core. So we might have a CPU that can run at 4 gigahertz and one that can run 2.5 gigahertz. Now, depending on the CPU, this may be for all the cores or maybe just like one core at a time. You'll have to look at the specs to know for sure. So this is how many instructions the CPU can handle per second. So over here at 4 gigahertz, that's 4 billion instructions per second, and then 2.5 billion instructions per second. That sounds like a lot of instructions, and it can be, but you'd be surprised how many instructions need to happen for something to process. Another aspect of how quickly the CPU runs is the IPC, or the instructions per clock. So if our CPU 1 over here with 4 gigahertz runs with 1 instructions per clock, then of course it gets 4 billion instructions per second. But if our hypothetical CPU 2 over here with 2.5 gigahertz has an instructions per clock of 2, then it would have 5 billion instructions per second, which would obviously be faster. Now, unfortunately, CPU companies don't just tell you the instructions per clock. You can kind of test and kind of figure out, but you're not getting an exact number like this. So the only way to be sure is, if you really care about instructions per clock, you probably want to get the newest thing, because the newest CPUs will always have higher instructions per clock, will almost always have higher instructions per clock than the previous ones. They might have the same, but usually they'll have at least a small increase. So it's much more likely the instructions per clock is in the double or triple digits instead of the single digits, because otherwise we'd see a huge swing from like one generation to the next. But usually it's like 5 to 10% or something. So that would tell me that there's got to be at least double digits, probably triple digits. Okay, another important aspect of the CPU is the cache, which is how data that it stores directly on it instead of putting it on the system memory, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So each core can have its own cache, so that would be level 1 cache. This means each core is directly responsible for that data, and that will access the quickest. Now, if the data that it needs is not in the level 1 cache, then it can go up from that to the level 2 cache, which is usually going to be split between cores. So it could be between 2 cores or 4 cores, just depends on how the CPU is laid out. And then if the data is not there, then it can go up to level 3 cache, which is shared among all the cores. Some CPUs will have additional cache compared to other ones, especially the AMD 3D CPUs, but for most applications, that extra cache won't do anything. It's much bigger for games. Now, if the data that the CPU needs is not on any of these cache levels, then it's going to have to go talk to the system memory or the random access memory. I said earlier that I would talk about how something works on a recommended. For me to recommend a CPU, I also have to recommend a motherboard and memory at the same time, because they all go together. So we're going to talk about the memory, then we'll talk about motherboards, and then I'll talk about all of them together. So for memory, also has a socket like the CPU does. It has a capacity, which is how much stuff the memory can hold. The speed is how fast the memory can be read or written. And the timing is how long it takes for the memory to be accessed. So let's take a look at some sockets real quick. The most common ones right now are DDR4 and DDR5. I've hopefully lined it up so that you can see here that they do not they don't match. This slot is not in the same spot on both of these. So you cannot stick these in the wrong slot. It will not work. You cannot just put the DDR5 into a DDR4 slot and it'll slow down to DDR4 speeds. Or you can stick the DDR4 in the DDR5 and it'll run at DDR4 speed. No, you cannot do that. The nice thing about memory is that there's no fancy names or numbers, they just tell you the specs. So let's take a look at a memory kit here and we'll analyze. First thing is the generation slash socket, so we can see DDR4 right there. Then we can see the capacity. So this is two 8 gigabyte sticks of RAM, as they're called. It doesn't have to be like this. It could be two 16 gigabytes or it could be one 16 gigabyte stick. This is just this config. Here's the speed of the memory, which is 3200 megatransfers per second. Now the thing about that is that's actually double the frequency. So as the CPU has a frequency, the memory also has a frequency. But because the memory is double data rate, that's what DDR means, they'll usually list it as double the frequency. So normally this memory would operate at 1600 megahertz. And then because it's double data rate, it would be able to send out twice that much data. Now the timings are going to be listed down here. The cast latency determines how quickly the memory can be accessed, and I'm pretty sure all calls to the memory are going to have to go through this one, and then you'll see other timings below that. So the 16 is the cast latency, and then there's the other ones. You can go do some more research about those if you want, but basically it's just how long it takes the memory to be accessed. Now the 16 here is 16 clock cycles for the memory to be accessed. So if the memory speed increases and the timings stayed the same, then it would be accessed quicker because it would do more cycles. So let's look at some DDR5 memory here. So these are 6000 speed, and you'll see that their latency is 36 and 30 respectively. So the 30 would kind of be like having almost like a 15 on the other one, though this is not quite double the speed. So since these are 6000 speed, their latency is higher, but the actual time that it takes is going to be roughly about the same. These would be the cheapest DDR5 sticks that are 6000, at least that I would trust. And no, I'm not like sponsored by G-Skill or anything, but usually they have some of the best deals. Now, if you like your memory to have lights on them for some reason, which some people do, and you can change the color of them, or they can go through the color spectrum. Okay, let's talk motherboards. The main thing that motherboards do is they hook all your stuff together. They provide power delivery and connectivity both for parts and also out to you, as there are slots directly to connect out to stuff. So for example, like on this part here, this is where you would connect your stuff like your mouse, keyboard, etc., monitors potentially, or you connect your monitor down here where the graphics card would be in. So motherboards are going to have a CPU socket, RAM sockets or slots. They're going to have connectivity for expansion slots. So that would be in these slots down here. So usually you'd put like a graphics card in here, but you can also sometimes put in extra storage. So on most of these, the storage slot is behind this cover right here, and sometimes they can have extra slots. I don't think any of these have additional extra slots for storage unless they're behind this thing, which they might be. The PCIe lanes are connectivity provided by your CPU, and it will depend on the CPU as far as how many you get and which generation you get. Usually right now the standard is generation 4, but there are some generation 5 connectivity options as well. Okay, this is going to be a simplified version, of course. Let's pretend we have 8 lanes from lane 0 over there to lane 7, and kind of think of this as like a highway. So when you hook up things, they're going to use lanes. So for example, plug up our video card, that's probably going to use at least half of our lanes. A lot of times they'll use like 2/3 or 3/4 of your lanes. So, but for right now, let's just say it uses half your lanes. Okay, so then let's say when plugging your storage drive, okay, we'll say that uses 2 more lanes. You're like, you know what, that storage drive not big enough, or maybe I bought a new one that's even bigger. So let's boom. Okay, now we're using all of our lanes. And you say, man, I want to plug in another storage drive. Now, I'm not exactly sure how it's going to do this, but this is just an example, so don't assume that this is how it's going to break up your lanes. So we're going to split these 2 lanes here at the end, and then boom. Now you got storage drive split up like that. Now in reality, it's probably not going to do it exactly like that, but this is how you can visualize how PCI lanes kind of work. Okay, let's talk about motherboard chipset. The motherboard chipset is kind of like the specification for the motherboard. The manufacturer like Intel or AMD can specify certain things that they want that chipset to provide. So here's the chipset for AM4 motherboards. Now over here you'll notice the models, they'll have an A, a B, and an X. But the problem is that's redundant, because if it's a 20, A and 20 mean the same thing, B and 50 mean the same thing, X and 70 mean the same thing. So like a B450, B550, that's just redundant. You could just say 550 or a B5 or however you want to think about it. The letters are redundant. one of the things that this chipset does is it provides PCIe connections. However, the CPU usually provides more and better connections than the chipset. So usually you don't really have to worry about this column. So like for example, my B450 motherboard says only provides PCI 2.0, but my CPU provides PCI 3.0, and I think it provides 24 lanes, so this doesn't really matter to me. But the chipset can have certain other features, like for example, if you're allowed to overclock it. So for example, you have like the A520, or like these up here, you're not allowed to overclock it. But if you have any other ones, you can, so that might be something you care about. And there's also which CPU generation they support. So you'll see here it varies. So like for my B450, I had to get a motherboard update for this to work. So, but if you like the X570, boom, you can just drop Zen 3 right in there. So when you're looking to buy a motherboard, you'll need to consider the chipset, what sort of features they have, and what level of connectivity they might have additionally, or what sort of features you're getting. A lot of times you're paying extra for the like X series over the B series, and you're usually not getting a whole lot, if anything. You might be getting something sometimes. So like for example, in the new AMD AM5 socket, they have E models, and E indicates that they have PCIe 5.0 support for sure. So let's look at some combos of CPU, motherboard, and RAM. So this would be maybe like an entry level. I guess you could potentially go even lower than this, but this would be a decent place to get started on a production system. I have this CPU. I don't have that motherboard though, but I don't have this exact setup, but that's the CPU that I have. You could go for a lower tier model than this one, but the 8-core ones will give you a decent amount of cores if you're running an application that cares about cores, and if you're not, then this will still be a decently fast CPU. Another option is you could step up to the 5900X, or you could step up to the 5950X if you wanted to pay even more. Usually the 5900X is a better value, so if you're really constrained on money and but the performance of the 5700X isn't quite up to your expectations or your time or schedule, then you could run with the 5900X. And of course, like I said, you can go up to the 5950X as well, but that's going to cost quite a bit more money, and the performance increase won't quite be as high. You will get 4 more cores, but the difference between 8 and 12 is 50%. The difference between 12 and 16 is only 33%. Now, if you wanted to go with a newer platform, which you have more upgrade options, you could go with the 7700X. Though you're going to spend about $200 more on that, but AMD will release new CPUs for this AM5 saga, so you could upgrade this in the future. Another option, if you want to go with Intel, you could get the 13600K, which is, from the tests I've seen, really competitive with the 7000 series and a pretty good value. This does cost a bit more because of the motherboard. I'm not sure if you could get a cheaper motherboard, possibly. Oh, also, you'll see the memory I have here is different because of the Intel. This generation of Intel can currently use faster memory than the 7000 series from AMD, though whenever the 9000 series come out, I'm sure they'll be able to use memory that's at least this fast, probably even faster. You don't have to use the 7200 DDR5 here. You could use something slower if it'll save you, $50 or whatever, and that's a big deal for you. You could totally do that. And then if you want top of the line, you could get the 7900 or 7950. I believe the 7950 is only available with the X version. So of course this is actually not that much more. This is about the same price as getting the 13600K. I'm pretty sure the 7900 in any multi-core workload, I think, will blow the 13600K out of the water, but in a single core application, or a application that only uses a few cores, I think the 13600K will probably be faster, but you should check reviews and make sure on that one because it'll depend on the application. An important note here I want to make: do not buy the 7900X3D or the 7950X3D or any of those, because most applications will not benefit from the extra cache, and any applications that do benefit from the extra cache, the cache is only on one set of cores. It's not on both sets. I don't know why they did that. I think it's really fucking stupid, and I wish they hadn't done it, but until they change that, do not buy those. Okay. Now, if you want to do production stuff where you use all your cores and you also want to do some gaming, you could potentially buy one of those, but to me it'd be a huge waste of money. I probably wouldn't do that, but if you really want to do both, you could potentially do that, but I wouldn't go for that route. If you have an application that really needs a high core count CPU and can't use the graphics card for some reason, you could get AMD Threadripper. Now, you don't have to necessarily get this generation. There are older generations, but this is the current generation. These are very expensive, as you can see, and the additional hardware that goes with them is very expensive as well. So these are absolutely not for the faint of heart. You need to be getting paid, and you need to be getting paid based on how long it takes for things to process. If you're not, then just go get the 7950X or something similar to that. These are not worth it. Unless your income depends on these or your work is paying for them, I would not get these. And now if work is paying for them and how long you take you to do stuff at work is important for your job, then absolutely these could be worth it. But for everybody else, I would stay away, because let's go to the next slide. A motherboard for one of these CPUs costs $900, and you have to get special memory as well. You cannot just stick regular DDR5 in there. You have to get this special. Now, it doesn't have to be this specific memory that I've chosen here, but this would be a set that should work with those CPUs that I showed earlier. And you also have to get a special cooler. So here's an example of an air cooler. And just getting the motherboard memory and cooler that I showed earlier is almost $2,000. And then if you've got the cheapest current generation Threadripper CPU, that would be $2,500, and it would cost over $4,000. And of course, add additional thousands of dollars if you want to go up the product stack. Okay, now some applications like the graphics card, because the graphics card is much better at parallel processing than the CPU. As we showed earlier, the CPU can parallel process things across multiple cores, but the graphics cards are made to do that. Some applications will really benefit from a graphics card. You may ask how the graphics card stacks up to something like Threadripper. Well, it'll depend on the application, because some applications will not be able to run on the CPU, and they may have to be ran on the graphics card. Or, again, some applications may not be able to run on the graphics card, and they may have to be run on the CPU. So, in a head-to-head test, I'd say the graphics card is probably going to be better, especially if you're comparing like a Threadripper to a very powerful graphics card. They can cost thousands of dollars. The graphics card is almost certainly going to do better. So much like CPUs, graphics cards have cores/processors. They have their own memory. Now, this is not the cache. They actually have their own memory that's separate from the system memory. It's how much power they draw, because they can use quite a lot. The Threadripper CPUs also use a lot of power. And then, of course, the graphics cards take up a certain number of PCIe lanes. So let's look at the RTX 4000 series. This is the latest one from NVIDIA. And we're going to kind of sort through this mess and figure out what's what. So the first thing is we're going to look at how many processors/cores they have. I honestly don't know what all of those numbers mean, but I just look at the same spot on each one. So like the RTX 4090 here has 16,000, whatever that means. And this one up here is like 10,000. So just as long as you're comparing these same number, or like you could look at this number if you wanted. Just make sure you're comparing the same number and you can get an idea of the difference between them. There's also the speed at which the cores run, just like on the CPU. So this will determine how quickly all of the cores can operate. Now the number in parentheses will be how quickly, like say like a one core could run. If you had to do something that just went on one core, it might be able to do that speed. And it might be able to do that speed on like half the cores, but probably not all the cores at the same time. Another important factor is the bandwidth of the memory. So that is how much memory and how quickly it can be accessed by the graphics card. This is important when it's doing calculations. Wider the bus, the more the memory can be accessed at once, and the faster the memory, the quicker it can transfer data to be read or written potentially. And the bandwidth can make a huge impact on the performance of the graphics card, especially if you're doing very large calculations. And there will be even what are called professional graphics cards that use special memory that has a very high bandwidth, so they can be accessed even quicker. And last but absolutely not least is the power for the graphics card. These can get pretty high, so you'll need to make sure your power supply is up to the task of powering these. Now, for some reason, these don't list you the PCI lanes, so we're going to have to go over to the AMD chart. And as you can see here, most of these will use 16 lanes, and I'm pretty sure almost all the NVIDIA ones will use 16 lanes as well. So when you're thinking about what devices you're going to connect and how many PCI lanes you have to work with, obviously make sure you're factoring your graphics card lanes. Now, something you might be thinking about is, do I even need a graphics card? If I know my applications are all going to run on the CPU and I don't have any that are going to run on my graphics card, do I even need a graphics card? Well, some CPUs do not have integrated graphics, so you must have a graphics card to use the CPU. And then also, if you have a graphics card, you can plug up multiple monitors to your machine, which I'm generally going to recommend. It's a lot easier to work with stuff if you don't have to constantly be all tabbing, if you can look across multiple monitors to work on stuff, which I'm doing right now. So I would recommend getting a graphics card, even if it's just have multiple monitors. This would be the kind of entry-ish level available from last generation at the time of making this video. So you get an RX 6600 or a 6650 XT. Now, you can go for an older one than this. If you know your applications are not going to run on the graphics card at all, you could go with something older, like a used RX 580 or maybe a 5700 XT or something. You don't have to get something this new or this powerful. But if you do have applications that are going to run on the graphics card, this would probably be like the minimum that I would set, unless you're really, really strapped for cash. Some other options would be you could get any of these from eBay. Now, of course, these listings will probably not exist when you actually go there. You'll have to look around, and now notice this one down here says free returns. If you're buying stuff on eBay, I recommend you only buy from sellers that accept returns. They don't necessarily have to accept free returns, but sellers that accept returns, because sometimes you can get something in, it may not work at all, or it may have quail wine, which means it'll make extra noise you probably don't want, or there's maybe something wrong with it. It might be really dirty, or the picture might not be the one they sent you. So it's good to be able to send stuff back. Now, for some even more powerful stuff, you can get a 7900 XT. The 7800 XT is about the same as a 6800 XT over here, but you can get a used 6800 XT for cheaper. Now, you cannot get a new 6800 XT at the time of making this video, so you have to get a 7800 XT if you only wanted to buy new. The 7800 XT is quite a bit more powerful, but it's also $200 more. And then if that wasn't enough power for you, you could go up to the 7900 XTX. I don't know why it's called that, but that's what they decided to name it. Now, there are graphics cards more powerful than this, but this is the maximum I would personally spend at the time of making this video. Obviously, there will be more powerful stuff in the future, but the only things that are really on par or more powerful than these would be these. Now, as you can see, I have the MSRP shown here, and the 4080 Super, despite coming out like a month ago, is already 10% above MSRP, which is totally unacceptable in my opinion. And the RTX 4090, this is the cheapest one on Newegg anyway, is 25% over MSRP, and some of them are even more expensive. A lot of them are even more expensive than that. Not twice as fast as the 7900 XTX. I don't think in any application. So if I was concerned about my money at all, I would much rather go with the 7900 XTX. Now, if you have a lot of money and your work depends on how quickly you can finish tasks, there are these. Now, I'm going to be clear, these are not comparable. I could not find the AMD equivalent of this, and I could not find the NVIDIA equivalent of this. Okay, this is kind of like a professional user graphics card. This is like an enterprise data center thing. Okay, so you're probably not going to buy this just for like home use. You might potentially buy something like this. And before you ask how's this compared to the 4090, it's not even close. This will obliterate the 4090, but if you bought NVIDIA's comparable thing, it would obviously also be a lot more powerful as well. Let's talk about monitors really quick. If you want the full monitor breakdown for how they work and all the details, go watch the gaming section. But the thing you're going to want here is probably want more than one monitor. As I mentioned earlier, you could get 2, 3, or potentially 4 monitors, depending on how much space you have, and depending on the size of the monitors, of course. And I recommend you get an IPS LCD monitor, or if you have a lot of money, or really the colors of the stuff you're working on is really important, you could get OLED. Okay, I just put these on the same slide, so I didn't have to have a slide with just each of these by themselves. These are not comparable. Just need monitors, like 2 or 3 monitors to, just have a display. This up here is perfectly fine. You can probably even get something cheaper than this, but this would be pretty solid for $100. This is in a totally different class. Like I said, if you have a lot of money to spend, you could get something like this, and it will be pretty nice. But like I said, you could get 14 of those for the price of this one. So yeah, I would not even consider this, honestly. But I'm just putting it on here so you have an idea of how much they might cost. Now, you could get these. They're a little bit bigger and have a higher resolution than the ASRock that I showed in the last slide. I have this G27Q, but it's really, really red, so you're probably going to have to adjust the red levels on this, especially if you're doing art. But I really like the colors on this one compared to what I had before. And the M27Q down here is basically just a better version. It has a higher refresh rate, faster response time, and wider color gamut. Again, if none of that meant anything to you, go back and watch the gaming section for the monitor breakdown. But yeah, now you don't have to get these specific ones that I recommend. I'm just showing you some examples. There will be some more monitor recommendations in the gaming section if you want some more details about that. Let's talk about them. So what does storage do? How does it work? So let's say over here on our storage, we have a spreadsheet that we're working on, and we have our calculator application. Of course, there's going to be way more things in storage besides just that, but let's just work with that for right now. So let's say we want to open our spreadsheet to do some work on it. So we're going to read our spreadsheet, and we're going to load it into the memory. So now we have the outfit over here. Now you're probably asking, why do we put it in the memory? Well, what's the point? Couldn't we just work with it off the storage drive? Well, kind of. The reason we put it into the memory is because the memory is significantly faster than the storage drive. So we can put our spreadsheet into the memory, then we can make changes to it, and then we can then come back and save it to storage later. The reason we don't just save it on the storage is every single time you make a change to it, you have to update the storage and then read it back out. So that would be pretty slow, especially on older hard drives. Newer storage drives are a lot faster, but it's still better to work with it in the memory. So let's say we want to, let's say we want to launch our calculator and run some math on our spreadsheet. So we're going to read the calculator app from the storage and we're going to load into the memory. Now, so we made some updates to our spreadsheet and we want to store it for later. So we're going to save, and then that's going to write our spreadsheet to the storage, and we're going to overwrite the one that's there. And let's say we're finished with the calculator, so we're going to close that. Poof! It's gone from the memory. So this is kind of a basic demonstration of how storage and memory work. And again, the reason we have storage and memory separate is because memory is really fast, but once you turn the computer off, it can't hold on to anything anymore. Okay, whereas the storage can't hold on to things after the power's turned off. So, and again, the calculator, we didn't need to save anything when we closed the calculator. We were just finished with it, so we didn't need to save anything. So storage is going to have a connection / form factor, capacity of course, and how fast it is. And somewhat like memory, storage drives often just list off the specs on them. So let's take a look at one. So the first thing we're going to look at is the connection / form factor. And there's a lot of things I just circled right there, so let's break them down. So it connects with PCIe Gen 4 and uses 4 lanes. So it's telling you it's going to use 4 lanes. Now, the funny thing here is NVMe and M.2.2280 are kind of synonymous with each other. There are different M.2 dimensions. This is just the most common one. There will be some that are smaller. So if this is smaller, that means that this will be physically shorter, and there is one that's longer than this one. But most normal motherboards will accept this or smaller. Okay, and of course the next thing is going to be the capacity. So that's 1 terabyte. Now, depending on who you ask, 1 terabyte may or may not be a lot. I think most people will probably say 1 terabyte it'd be like the minimum they would expect their computer to have, and some people would probably say they might want like 2 or 4 terabytes instead, or maybe even more. It just depends on your needs. Sometimes games can be really small, like they can be a few kilobytes or maybe a few megabytes, and some games can be really large. They can take up hundreds of gigabytes. So if you're someone who has lots of, especially AAA games, you probably are going to think 1 terabyte's not that big. But if you play a lot of indie games, 1 terabyte might seem like plenty. And if you're someone who does production where you have like lots of large files, 1 terabyte might be absolutely nothing, and you might need 8 or even more terabytes. And then lastly, we can look at the speed here. Now, in this case, we should expect that because this is a PCI Gen 4x4 drive, this is the maximum speed that this interface allows it to run. So we should expect this sequential read to be up to this amount. Now, the reason it says sequential read is if you're reading files that are all right next to each other. If you're jumping around, then you can look at the random speed. But for PCI 4.0, you would expect at least this speed. Now, this is a pretty solid drive, but let's take a look at a couple other ones real quick. This is a PCI 3.0 drive. Now, they used to have some of these that were faster, but for some reason I don't know if they stopped making them or if they're sold out, but PCI 3.0x4 goes up to half of PCI 4.0, which would be 3,500. So do not buy these. Well, I mean, you could buy these, but they're way too expensive for this amount of speed. There were some MP34s, which had 3,500 megabytes per second, but they don't sell them anymore. So yeah, watch out when you're buying and don't get these slower ones. Now, for games, the speed of this doesn't really matter. Most games cannot load at the speed of these PCIe drives. But for your operating system, other files, you will be able to see that difference. So don't buy a faster drive just for games, but if you're doing work and you will work with lots of large files, being able to read out those a lot faster might be beneficial to you. Now, so far we've only looked at PCIe drives, but there are also SATA drives. Now, these are significantly slower, as you can see. And in the past, this would be what you'd get, especially for large storage. Now, this one up here is way too expensive for this amount of storage, and honestly, this one is kind of too. I would not get either of these personally. These are just an example. There probably are some cheaper ones out there, but the memory has come down a lot in price. So I personally just wouldn't even fool with a SATA drive. And a lot of times when you hook up a SATA drive, it'll use PCI lanes from your motherboard anyway, so you'll have to be careful about that. Okay, here are some that I would actually consider getting, and as you can see, the price of these is basically the same as these prices over here, except these are both 1 terabyte. Only this one's 1 terabyte, this one's 500 gigabytes, which is half of a terabyte. So these are both 1 terabyte, and they are significantly faster. As you can see, they're PCI 3.0, and they run at 3,500 megabytes per second. Again, that's up to, they won't necessarily always run that fast, but they can run that fast. Now these will degrade. These will degrade a little bit over time, so keep that in mind if you're going to have them for a long time. But yeah, these two would both be pretty reasonable options. Now for PCI 4.0, you could get the Team Group one that I showed earlier. That would be perfectly fine. These are from Samsung, and I know Samsung makes these because Samsung makes memory. I'm not sure who's making the Team Group ones. It's probably going to be Micron or Hynix, which is totally fine too. But if you wanted to get directly from the person who makes them, the Samsung sells them as well. These can be a bit more expensive compared to the other ones, but they're kind of marketed as kind of like a premium brand. Now, there are some models with heatsink like this one down here. I'm not sure exactly how much the heatsink does, but PCI 4.0 drives can get kind of hot, so it's probably recommended that you get one with a heatsink. They're like if we go back to the Team Group one, that's what these fins are on here for. They want air to pass through these, and then it will cool off the storage drive. Now, there are PCI 5.0 drives, but I'm going to be honest with you. Why? Most games cannot take advantage of a PCI 4.0 drive, and the only reason I'd even think about a PCI 5.0 drive is if I had like a server, like a data center or something, in which case, yeah, maybe. But for just like regular consumer use, no, because PCI 5.0 drives have to have like fans on them directly. They have to have their own dedicated cooling, and you also have to have special motherboards for them. They're going to cost a lot. I would not. All right, let's talk about everybody's favorite component, power supplies. Just kidding. Most people probably don't care that much. So obviously the wattage, the form factor, and the modularity. The form factor, there are like smaller form factor power supplies. If you have like a small case, you'll need to get a smaller power supply probably. But if you have a regular size case, you can just get a full size one. Now determining how much wattage you need on your power supply. If you get a PC part picker and you assemble all your components in there, it'll give you an estimate of how much power it can use. So I would get like probably like absolute minimum that amount, but you probably would want to go higher, maybe like at least 25% higher. Some people say 50% higher, some people even say 100% higher than that. Depends on how powerful your components are, how much you need. Now some power supplies will actually not have enough connections. Sometimes graphics cards can take a lot of connectors, and if your power supply is weak, it may not have enough connectors in the first place. When you're shopping, usually your graphics card will have a recommended power supply specification, so you could probably get that one or higher. I'm going to have this link in the description, but go to this website right here. They review power supplies. These are two you could get if you need 750 watts, which I would say is a pretty reasonable amount for most people. Now, if you have like a really powerful graphics card and maybe a really powerful CPU, you may have to get above 750 watts, but 750 watts would probably be just fine for most people. I have 650 watts, but there are some graphics cards I can't use because of that. So these would be two excellent ones, and they are on this tier list as well. So somehow I just didn't talk about modularity at all. So both of these power supplies are fully modular. It says right here full modular and full modular. So if we go back, as you can see here, they have all these connections. So this means you can connect all the cables you need and not connect any cables that you don't need. Some older, especially power supplies, will not have this. You'll just have cables coming out here, and you'll connect the ones you need and not connect the ones you don't need. Or some will have some of the cables you need, like the motherboard 24 pin, and then they'll have like some slots over here. So it'll just depend on which one you're buying. And last but not least, you need somewhere to put your motherboard and components. Cases not only protect your components, but they also provide cooling for the components, which is very important, especially for high power components like graphics cards. So you might be wondering, can I just get any case I want? Does it really matter? Well, some cases can cost quite a bit, and they may offer some additional advantages. Let's take a look at why you might want to spend more on a case potentially. So here would be a normal case layout. Your motherboard is going to be, we'll say in the top left here, your graphics card is going to be hooked in it if you have one, and your power supply is going to be in the bottom, usually. Normally, your fan setup is probably going to be something like this. You can have at least one fan in the front, and you're going to have airflow that flows up this way, and your CPU is going to be here, and it's going to have its cooler, and you're going to bring air into the CPU cooler and then take the hot air out. Now, there's obviously a lot more room we could put fans in here potentially, so a common trend is to just stick more fans on the front. Sometimes you'll have 2, 3, or 4 fans on the front, and this brings more air in. And another thing people like to do sometimes is they'll try to stick an extra fan down here. Now the problem is your graphics card pulls in air from down here, usually. And with this setup, you're getting probably a little bit of air from this fan in there, but this is not really the ideal setup for cooling your graphics card. Now, if you have a lower power graphics card, even a setup like this is probably going to be just fine at keeping it cool. You don't necessarily have to do anything crazy. And this would maybe help you out a little bit more. But if you have a high power graphics card that uses, say, like 300 watts or more, you may want to get a case that has cooling directly from the bottom, like the Fractal Torrent. Fractal Torrent comes with 2 very large fans in the front and 3 fans on the bottom. Now, note here on the bottom there is a dust filter on both of these sides, since that's where it draws in air. So the fractal torque mounts the power supply in the top, and by doing this, it lets you have fans directly under the graphics card. For most people, this is not necessary, but you could get this set up if you have a powerful graphics card. So, all right, let's take a look at some prices. So these top two cases here are the highest rated as far as reviews go, and then this one is, of course, the most selling. These are about $100, as you can see. And then the fractal torque down here is, of course, about twice as much. So I wouldn't recommend it unless you just wanted to buy this case and never have to worry about buying another case in the future, but you probably would have to replace the fans eventually, as they would probably wear out. There are different versions of these, so like if you want them in white, for example, or you want one with like colored fans, you can get those. There are a lot of options over cases. These are just some examples. There's plenty of other cases. You don't have to just get one of these. Oh, one thing you'll have to watch out for in your buying cases, some cases come with no fans, so factor that into the price. Like the fractal torque comes with all the fans it needs. I mean, you could put extra fans on the top and back, I guess, if you wanted. So like in our example here, you see there's no exhaust fans, but there's so much airflow coming in here and air pressure that it'll just force air out the top and back. But yeah, some cases will be like $200 and come with no fans, which I'm like, why the fuck would I even want to buy that? All right, you know what time it is. We're talking input devices. So there are two main types of keyboards. There's membrane and mechanical. Now they both function pretty similarly. When you press a key, it closes a circuit, but the way that they do is a little differently. So membrane keyboards have two sheets, and when you press a key, it pushes the sheets together. They're usually pretty cheap, and there's usually a lot more options for them compared to mechanical keyboards. And then there are mechanical keyboards, which are more expensive. Now they're not more expensive because they're better necessarily, they're just more expensive because they're more complicated. You can look up a video on how they work if you want more details about it. And there's also different types of switches so that you can change out if you can adjust how they feel or sound. As you can see there, I said they're loud because there's two pieces of metal that click together every time you press a key, but there are some switches that are less clicky, if you will. Now, some people say the mechanical keyboard feels better. I don't know, I've never used one because they're just so expensive. I'm just totally checking out on that. This is the keyboard I have, and you'll notice that it doesn't have a number pad or a bunch of other things over there on the right side that would normally be like right here. That's on purpose, and I'll talk about this in a second when we talk about my desk setup, but I'd never used a number pad, and I don't think that having here is worth it. Now, if you do use the number pad, there are other options. You can buy a specific number pad and put it somewhere else on the desk, and again, we'll talk about that more in just a second, but for now, let's talk about mice. I don't really have a whole lot to say about mice, unfortunately. There's no like really good guide out there or anything, so my best advice is go to Walmart or Best Buy or Micro Center if you're blessed to live near a Micro Center and just feel them up and find one that fits your hand well and seems comfortable. Now, if you don't live somewhere where you can go check out mice in person, maybe order 2 or 3 and test them out, see which one feels best for you, and then send the ones you don't like back. I don't know if that counts as cheating, but you can do that. All right, let's talk about, desks and chairs. Now, I'm not going to have a specific like recommendation for a desk or a chair in this video because I don't know, man. I would recommend you go to an office supply store and check out a desk and chair there, ideally together. Do not buy a gaming chair because gaming chairs are not ergonomic. Usually gaming chairs are going to have like a straight back or they're going to be curved like this. This is bad. This does not support your back. You want a chair that supports your back with something kind of like this. So your butt would be like here, and then your arch of your back will be here, and then your back will probably come up through here. This could be more vertical potentially. So look for a chair that's something like this. And personally, I would recommend getting a mesh chair as well. Some have a mesh back and a not mesh bottom. I have a mesh bottom and mesh back, and I have not had any problems with it. If you live somewhere where it's colder or like, winter gets cold, you can put like a blanket or a towel over this, and that'll sort that problem out. But yeah, I would recommend a mesh chair and get one that's kind of shaped something like this. All right, let's talk about my desk setup. Pretend this is my desk and my PC is over here. I don't have anywhere else to put it really, so I just put it right here, but this could be annoying to you depending on if the fans are loud or whatever. Okay, let's put my keyboard and mouse in the middle here. Now, I position these so that my arms are about as straight as they possibly can be. So you'll notice that this arm here is pretty much perfectly straight. It might be bent a little bit depending on how I'm sitting, but I want this arm to be as straight as possible. And now the problem with this arm is if I made this arm straight, I have to push the keyboard over to the left here more, okay? And that would be bad because when I want to type, I have to bend this arm over here. So I have this is kind of in a compromised position for me because obviously I can't have the mouse inside of the keyboard. I'd have to have the keyboard like over here for this arm to be straight. I have the keyboard over here, but the mouse needs to be right. Now, if your keyboard was longer, you'd have to put your mouse over here or even further, which means this arm would have to be like bent out awkwardly, and that would be uncomfortable. So that's why I don't have a number pad. Now, If I needed a number pad, I could have a number pad like over here, maybe somewhere, or I could put it like up here and I could pull it down when I need it and put it back up here or something. Some people will take their keyboard and they'll like bend it like this, and then they have to like cant your wrist around sideways, and oh god, that's awful. Don't do that. So I'm not saying you have to copy this setup exactly, but try to have something close to this. You thought I was going to forget the headphones, but no, I didn't. You don't have to get these like specific ones, but these are the ones I would recommend. I've had these for a long time. They're really good, and I don't have any complaints, except that the ear cups they come with by default are like a little too small. Not really sure how to explain that exactly, but a lot of the ones I bought would like pinch my ears. And you can actually get aftermarket ear cups for these, which help. I don't know if this is the exact ones. It says these are just replacements, so that makes me think they're not the extra large ones. But somehow you can get some extra large ones to make them a bit more comfortable, and I'd recommend them. And also make sure you change them eventually, because they will get dirty. Okay, so this is a question that you probably didn't consider asking yourself, is where should I put my monitors? Now if you look online, it'll tell you to do something like this. This is terrible. Don't do this. This is going to cause your neck to hurt probably. You're going to look down. Now my setup is probably not something you can emulate because I have a custom made shelf to put my monitors on. So you're probably going to have like a table with some books on it or something, which is kind of what I had before with one monitor, but that didn't really work for two monitors. So you might have to have a table or something behind your desk, but have your monitor set up more like this so that you're looking. So when you're sitting up straight, you want your monitor, you want it to be, looking at kind of like the upper middle part of the screen, or maybe around the middle. Okay. Because like with this setup, it's like, oh, put your eyes like level with like the top of the screen. I'm like, you have to look down all of the time to use the monitor, which is stupid. Don't do this. I don't have any back pain or hip pain or neck strain with this setup. So this is what I would recommend that you do. You don't have to copy this exactly. You don't have to have a shelf, but just put your monitor up more at eye level. Maybe not in the middle exactly, but something like this. And of course, if your monitor hits a stand, you can adjust this up and down. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. Obviously, to sit in this position, you'd have to imagine that my knees would be under the desk. So that means the chair needs to be able to roll under the desk, especially like the armrests. So having adjustable armrests will help with that, as you can chair at the right height for your feet to be just touching the ground, but have the armrests, low enough to clear the desk. Okay, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you have any questions that pertain to something in here, obviously ask them. If you think I got something wrong or you think I misrepresented something, let me know. And if I really messed up, I might re-upload the video, or I'll at least pin your comment. So hopefully you learned something, and I hope you found this video helpful.